Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the book Wormhole. This past month, I participated in the Summer Splash Readathon, originally created by Sally Thames. I got so much done off of the bingo board. This is what mine looks like at the end of the Readathon. I read a total of 8 books. Many of which cross off multiple prompts, and so a lot of the prompts I did more than once. So I'm thinking in order to keep this wrap up as efficient as I can, I'm just going to list on the screen which prompts each book crosses off. I'm also going to only note a few thoughts on each book rather than the in-depth reviews I usually do, but if there are any books in this video you'd be interested in seeing an in-depth review for, let me know in the comments and I might do a separate video for books of interest. And I'll talk about all lifestyle prompts I did at the end of this video. So the first book I read was Riot Baby by Tochi Onyebuchi. Ella was born with powers, one of which causes her to be plagued by visions of the future, where she sees how her neighbors will die, often at the hands of racism. Initially frightened by her powers, Ella drops out of society to protect people from harm. While away, her brother Kev is arrested, though the siblings are able to keep in contact through Ella's powers. Kev's unfair treatment by the justice system becomes the catalyst for Ella to develop her powers and understand the true purpose of them. I listened to this audiobook entirely in one sit-in, and by the end of it, I wanted to cry. It is such a powerful and raw book. One of the quotes that really stand out to me, and which I think summarizes the point Onyebuchi makes with this book, is slaves were freed at gunpoint, meaning slavery didn't end on its own accord. Action had to be taken before freedom was gained. The writing is very fragmented and jumps around a lot, but I think it well relays Ella's experience of being this clairvoyant that sees the larger picture of every person she interacts with. I love both the concept and the execution was well done. Onyebuchi follows Ella and Kev's life for many years, extending into the future, and he predicts how the justice system will develop alongside technology. This part of the book was so incredibly eerie, how tech is used to monitor ex-convicts and even control them with sedation, as well as being able to take away their housing and rights within a moment should they do anything out of line. And what's most creepy of all is that I can 100% see this happening. This was such an impactful read and a 5-star rating for sure. The next book I read was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. While driving home from a party, Star's friend Khalil is pulled over by a cop, and when Khalil goes to check to make sure Star is okay, back in the car, the cop shoots and kills him. Not only has Star witnessed a friend dying for the second time in her life, but when the media skews the incident in the cop's favor, Star is forced to stand up and speak the truth of what happened that night, no matter what the consequences. One of my favorite aspects of this book is how it balances these two very different sides of Star's life. She lives as a black girl. There's Star, who attends prep school as one of 2 black students in her year and has non-black friends and a white boyfriend. Then there's Star, who is living in a poor neighborhood with an ex-con, ex-gang member dad, and a half-sibling who is the child of the gang leader's wife. In school, Star pretends to live a normal high school life, but outside of school, she's faced with struggles no one her age should be put through, including having to fight for her dead friend's justice. One of my favorite moments in the book that perfectly shows this juxtaposition is the chapter after Star has been through a disheartening interview about Khalil's death, and her boyfriend asked if she has picked out her dress yet for prom, and of course Star hasn't because she's had no time to do so. Most kids Star's age would only be concerned with what they will wear to prom, but for Star, she doesn't get the luxury of a normal childhood because she was born black, and it really broke my heart. I like the inclusion of a character like Haley, who is a white girl Star used to be friends with, but after Star begins to call Haley out on some of the casually racist things she says, their friendship ends up on the rocks. Young adults so rarely depicts growing out of friendships, even though it is a common part of life, and I like that Star stands her ground, showing readers that you don't have to keep shitty friends in your life. Another choice I really liked in this book is the complexity of Khalil's background. Through Khalil, we see how easy it is for Black kids who grow up in poor neighborhoods to get stuck in this cycle of gangs and drug dealing. In most cases, they have very little other choice, and once you're in, it's nearly impossible to get out. Because Khalil was a drug dealer, the media tries to frame his death as cleaning up the streets, which is super messed up because this guy's just a kid, but probably true to life. I have mixed feelings about Star's boyfriend. He's a rich white boy who's a wannabe SoundCloud rapper and very into Black artists. I couldn't help but feel like he only likes Star because she's Black and that his desire to date her is more of a fetishizing Black girls thing than actual love. But to his credit, when he is later exposed to some of the harsh realities of Star's life as a Black girl, he does stand by her, even when it means putting himself in danger. But I still personally think Star could do better. This book has received a lot of praise and hype in the past, and after reading it, I understand why, and I think it's 100% deserved. This is a 5-star read for sure. Next book I read was Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. After the sudden death of Count Jainen's husband, Prince Tom, Jainen is arranged to marry Tom's cousin, Prince Kian, in order to maintain the treaty between their planets. However, when it comes to light that Prince Tom's death wasn't an accident, but rather murder, Jainen becomes the main suspect, and his marriage to Prince Kian and subsequently the agreed peace between their planets cannot be finalized until Jainen's name is cleared. This book has been on literally every TBR I've done since I started BookTube, so I finally had to read it. Even though my expectations for this book has slowly been slipping since I first put it on my TBR. What I wanted from this book was a cute tropey gay romance, which I definitely got. I don't know why, but I do really like the trope of arranged marriage to lovers. It's something I wouldn't like in reality, but it's a fun escapism thing for me, I guess. I also like huddling for warmth and dramatic public declarations of love, all of which this book has covered. From the very first hint Maxwell drops about Jainen's former relationship being abusive, I picked up on it immediately. And I think initially Maxwell does a really good job at hinting at it with various red flags. I like that we do get some rep of an abusive relationship just because men being the ones abused is so underrepresented, even though it does happen in reality, and even in gay relationships. I think this book could have a positive impact on people who are going through a similar situation, realizing the things that happened to Jainen aren't okay and that Jainen, and by extension themselves, deserve better, and that good, healthy, positive relationships are still a possibility after a toxic relationship ends. However, near the end, once Tom's treatment of Jainen is exposed, I do think Maxwell leaned a little too heavy on it. Maybe it was so readers who aren't as in tune with red flags will understand the depth of the mistreatment Jainen went through, but I also think showing Tom as only ever abusive towards Jainen isn't a reality of what abusive relationships actually look like. There are good moments in an abusive relationship, which can make it confusing and hard to see that a relationship is bad, as well as oftentimes outsiders have a hard time noticing the abuse because abusers usually act different in public. I felt that the sci-fi elements were weak, and I couldn't really get into the political storyline either. Also, when the culprit of Tom's murder is revealed, there's a scene which I can only describe as a villain speech, which felt too convenient. Like, if readers can't understand a character's motivation without them explaining it, it just kind of feels like poor writing, and honestly, I wouldn't have understood this character's motivation either if he didn't do a villain speech. By the last 2 hours of the audiobook, I was ready to finish this book and I cranked up the speed on it. But I am glad I finally read this book for myself because I've heard so many mixed reviews on it, and again, it's been on my TBR for quite a while. I ended up rating this one 3 stars, which is my rating for failed to impress me, but I am glad I read it. Next book I read was We Shall Sing a Song into the Deep by Andrew Kelly Stewart. After the surface world was destroyed by nuclear war, a cult forms in the crew of an old nuclear submarine, worshipping the last nuclear warhead aboard that they believe will bring the biblical second coming. On seldom trips to the surface, the cult occasionally rescues young boys to use as choristers. Remy is one of these choristers, except she's secretly not a boy. When the Kaplan, the only person who knows Remy's secret, dies, he gives her the launch key, telling her to hide it. Remy is conflicted between her personal beliefs and her promise to hide the launch key, and soon learns that everything she knows about the surface world might not actually be the truth. The concept is interesting and the setting of the submarine is vivid. Characters suffer from malnutrition, scurvy, and radiation poisoning, which added to the tone of the story. I also like the morbid detail about how the cultists castrate the boys when they become choristers, as this is historically something that was done to choir boys in order to spare their soprano voices from puberty. As much as I like the trope of female character masquerading as a male and needing to keep her identity secret, I felt like Remy being a girl had little effect on the story. I think Stewart wanted to give Remy a dangerous secret she had to keep, but she has enough dangerous secrets throughout the book that her identity felt unnecessary. I was also expecting some interesting gender exploration with her character, particularly given that Remy was abducted at such a young age. She doesn't remember her original name or where she came from. I think someone like her would grow up not associating herself with womanhood or understanding what makes her different from the other boys. So I think that was a missed opportunity. I was also left with some questions about the world building. It's alternate history, but I don't exactly understand the history that led to this or why the submarine became a cult, since the cult leader didn't seem interested in being a cult leader. And the timeline is confusing to me as well, since the nuclear war sounds like it happened not too long ago in the book, yet the cult members are so brainwashed. I'd have assumed they've been doing this thing for a few generations already. I think this book ultimately serves as a criticism of the detonation of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, particularly given that this book replicates the situation where there is this great-scale war that is already near its end, but the detonation of the last nuclear warhead could end it sooner, which adds further depth to the book and the decision near the end. I think there's a lot of good things in this book, but there's also a lot that could have been explored further, so I ended up rating this one 4 stars. Next book I read was Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. Lily Hugh has always known she is different, but it isn't until she first sees an advertisement for the Telegraph Club, a club where women dress up as men and flirt with other women, that she begins her journey towards self-discovery, becoming closer to fellow classmate and Telegraph Club frequenter, Kath, in the process. I buddy read this with Amelia from Amelia Reads, and I'm excited to do our discussion of this book because there are so many tiny details I really liked about this book. This was such a good historical fiction. I love that the author included timelines to contextualize different characters' events with larger real-life historical events. It's definitely a well-researched book. A lot of queer history stuff I was already familiar with, but I can imagine this book being informative to someone who wants to better understand queer history, but also the intersection with Chinese American history as well, which I'm not as familiar with. Lo well establishes the fear of communism and how it was used as an excuse to attack certain minorities in America, as well as, and something I never really associated with the 1960s, but the attitude of conformity. And it makes sense given the witch hunt happening with the Red Scare that people in the 60s would be afraid to be different. There was homophobia and racism depicted in this book, which was hard to stomach at times, particularly because a lot of it is stuff that still exists today, but it felt appropriate for the time period and relevant to the plot. But there was a point I needed to take a break from the book because it got a little too close to home for me. But overall, I thought this book was well executed. It balances Lily's personal plots with larger historical events and gives readers the full picture of what exactly Lily is going through, which I thought was fantastic. This was a 5-star read for sure. The next book I read was The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. During China's Cultural Revolution, scientist Ye Wenxiu is arrested. Her only hope for life outside of prison comes with agreeing to work on a secret military project. Decades later, scientists are being killed off in a conspiracy revolved around a virtual reality program called the Three-Body Problem. Nanotech scientist Wang Miao is enlisted to go undercover in the game in order to uncover this mysterious enemy that threatens the future of science and Earth alike. I had a hard time writing the synopsis for this book because the Goodreads synopsis is, in my opinion, a very big spoiler. I honestly had a lot of fun going into this book knowing as little as possible and just enjoying the mystery of it, because it was definitely a trip that way. Otherwise, I think I would have been really impatient to get to the reveal the synopsis spoils that doesn't come until, I think, the last 6 of the book. This book is refreshingly unique, and a part of that comes from being written by a Chinese author. I think that different world perspective comes through in what themes and issues are addressed in this book that I don't really see in American or English sci-fi, particularly at the start with China's Cultural Revolution, a real historical event that I knew absolutely nothing about until I read this book. I think Ye Wenxiu is the only fully developed character in this book. While most of the book follows Wang Miao's perspective, very little development is given to his character. Like, all we know about him is that he works with nanotech, he has a wife and a son. Very generic details, and he mostly feels like a tour guide leading us through this story without ever really understanding his personal feelings or motivations. I honestly didn't mind that terribly, but this is a caveat for people who like character-driven stories. This isn't that kind of book. This is definitely heavy on the science side, which tends to intimidate me at times. However, I never felt estranged by any of the science in the book. I think it's really approachable for people like me who don't have a strong background in physics. But as most good heavy sci-fi successfully do, it gets me interested in scientific concepts and discoveries I wasn't familiar with before. I rated this one 5 stars, and I think this is a contender for one of my favorite books I read this year. And from everything I've heard, the next 2 books in the trilogy are even more beloved than the first book, so I'm super excited to read on. And the last book I read this month was A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. Mosscap is the first robot to have contact with humans hundreds of years after robots gained sentience and decided to live apart from humanity in the wild. As the ambassador of its people, Mosscap is guided on a tour of various human settlements by the T-Monk Dex, where at each stop, Mosscap asks its question of humanity: what do you need? A question that becomes all the more difficult to answer when living in a solarpunk utopia. This is book 2 in the monk and robot duology. I like being able to jump right into the story with this book, whereas book 1 had a lot of setup to manage. This one was more episodic than the first book, with each chapter taking place in a different settlement and seeing different aspects of human life in this solarpunk future. As with most of Chambers' books, I found this to be a world I wanted to get lost in. But while comforting, this book, like the first, continues to ask really profound questions about life and leaves readers with a new appreciation for life. I continue to love Dex and Mosscap's friendship. I found myself smiling at so many points while reading their interactions. It's so endearing. And I don't have too much else to say about this book besides that I enjoyed it from beginning to end, and dare I say I like this book better than the first one. My only criticism is the ending. I'm pretty sure this is a duology, but this book isn't conclusive. It feels like it needed maybe one more chapter, if not a few more pages worth of resolution, particularly because I think Dex's main plot from the first book is never resolved, and I was expecting it to. Regardless, I'm still giving this one 5 stars because it's definitely up there with one of my favorite things Becky Chambers has written, and I can see myself revisiting this book in the future when I want to feel comforted. I started reading book Lovers by Emily Henry, which I was doing for yet another buddy read, but also for a book set in summer and also branch out, because I never read straight up romance. But I didn't finish the book yet, so it'll be in my August wrap-up. I'm reading it as an ebook, and I don't like reading books that way, but it was the only way for me to get my hands on a copy since the library waiting list was insane. But I did use the book as inspiration for one of my lifestyle prompts. For the Make It Like Picasso prompt, make a piece of art inspired by a book, I decided to make bars of soap inspired by 2 different books this month. One being Book Lovers, of course, and the other being Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. I did 2 different books because I wanted to, but I'll link the video in the description below for anyone who is interested. I also did the movie night prompt, which I ended up watching Escape from Skull Shores, one of the Monster High movies I've never seen before. I ended up liking it more than I thought I would. I had pretty low expectations for it, but it was definitely cute and fun. Otherwise, I'm pretty happy with the reading I've done this month. If you made it this far in the video, let me know in the comments what book you are looking forward to reading next month, as in August, because this is going up in August. Remember to support your local library and shop independent when you can, and until next time, please stay tuned.